name is Dave Fadeley, and I'm here to share a little bit with you what I found on risk and how to make it practical on the job. And I call it Risk Simply. This comes from a presentation I put together a number of years ago, what I used from some of my clients, the customers over in the federal government, over in the DoD Intel community, because I found there was a problem that people really weren't describing risk very well. Typically, you walk into a meeting, people showing risk, I talk about risk, they use 1 or 2 word descriptions. Things like, what's your risk schedule? What's your risk personnel, budget, people have left, those kind of really sort, and people all nod their heads, smile like, yeah, okay, but they really don't understand, well, what does that mean? What happened? What caused that? What's the uncertainty? What happens if those things actually do happen? What's the impact to my objectives? Things like that. Those are never talked about, and and then they wonder why things aren't effectively happening. So I put this together to try to help educate things I'd learned over the years. I hope you will too. Hope this is helpful. So the topics I want to talk about are the difference between a risk and an issue. They aren't the same. How to clearly identify and break down risks so that they're very clear. I'll give some worksheets as a way to do that, to make it helpful, very practical, working on a project as well. I'll give some examples and then share some references at the end. So what is risk? So fundamentally, it's uncertainty and it's something that matters. It's really important. It affects something that's important. For example, it can affect the program or the project objectives, whether it's cost or schedule or technical. And you can put a probability of it happening. That's the uncertainty part. The impact is, what is the impact of those objectives we talked about for your project? And the other aspect is you have to keep and realize that risk has not happened yet. Something could possibly happen. The difference between that as an issue is something has happened. So if a risk happens, it's now an issue and you got to deal with it. For example, 3 people left, 4 people going on vacation. You got to deal with it. That's an issue. Or there's a dependency that they're not delivered. They haven't delivered yet. It's not that they may not deliver. If they haven't, they've missed their deadline. That's an issue that happened. You got to deal with it now. So that's the difference. The other point I want to mention is there's threats and opportunities. There's good and bad risk. Most people just focus on the bad, of what the threats are and how they're going to handle that. But there's also opportunities that you can exploit to make things better, to enhance, to save money, maybe save time, those kind of things. So you want to address both, and I'll give examples of that as well. So risk. Rather than using 1 or 2 word descriptions, which you may use when you are actually presenting on a PowerPoint slide, and I'll talk about that later, but you want to have a further explanation ready in there and very clearly understood. And you want to break it down, and this is what I saw from 3 parts. To break it down to 3 parts is what I use and what I found in other seminars and other people. And it's broken down to the actual cause, the actual risk, the actual effect, or in other words, what the fact is that caused it, what the uncertainty, the unknown is, and what's the impact. So it's really given, if, then. So think of risk identification as breaking down to given, if, then statements. I think it was Dr. David Hilson, called the Risk Doctor, a number of years ago, a seminar I took at PMI, created stuff called meta language, just another way of thinking about breaking it down in those 3 parts. And his take is it's a structured description of a risk, which separates that cause, risk, and effect. So you can break it down into, given being a result of, or because of an existing condition, a cause, the if being something that's uncertain, it may occur, which would lead to something. Third part, then, and objectives. And the keywords on the bottom, you can see that you would use for those three parts. So if that's helpful, sometimes it is. When you're beginning, it's a good way to think about it. So the worksheet is basically like an Excel spreadsheet you can use to break it down. You can always actually have something in the far left saying, what you say on a PowerPoint slide to management, schedule, personnel, whatever. If you can't fit all this on there, use a very short description, and then have for example, a backup sheet or a spreadsheet or a PowerPoint slide that, it goes into more detail like this. It breaks it down to given, if, then statements, like we talked about. You can write them down here and break them down, but also include the risk response. And the risk response, there's two different types, right? There's for threats and opportunities. For threats, what are the 4 foundational responses? You can avoid it, avoid the risk. You can accept it, just let it happen. You can mitigate, which is typically done, which is how to reduce it. Or you can transfer it to somebody else or many other people, right, to get rid of it. But on the flip side, on good risk, there's opportunities. In parallel to those 4, you can exploit it, you can take it, you can use it, you can just accept it, let it happen, you can enhance it, make it better, and you can share the goodness with others as well. So those are all risk responses you want to consider when you're doing this, not just mitigate all the time, which is what most people do. And the easy way to remember this, the way I remember it, is use that acronym GIT or DONE, GITR, for given, if, then, risk response. Here is a typical like acquisition review board or quarterly program review risk slide. I think came out of standard like DoD type manuals, otherwise known as the stoplight chart, the red, green, yellow, where you multiply the impacts and the probability on the horizontal and vertical axis. The risk will show up in one of those areas, and you really focus on the stuff that's in the red, which is high. That's what those are typically used for, right? So when you do that, they have like the little columns in a row that's in the middle of the left there, and you're given if then risk statement. You can fit under the risk, or you have to use the 1 or 2 word description, and then the backup the given if then. But I would try to get the given if then in there. And where it says mitigation column, it really should be risk response, because mitigation is just one of the responses, depending on what it is. So relabel that as, you want to change that to it says risk response. And the lower left is, and you can't read on your screen, but there's a DoD risk management guide, has some really good guidelines on how you want to use those numbers 1 through 5 and under what conditions it would fit in there. So that's how these given if then statements, etc., would fit and modify into a typical stoplight chart for risk, like it's shown here. So example of a program risk sheet. So here were examples I made up a number of years ago, and the description contains your given if then. Far right, it says strategy. Well, that's really your risk response, right? And there's numbers you multiply in between to find a priority score and what you're going to work on first. This tends to be a fancy one. But you notice every description here has a given if then all there, and you see how it can, it can take up some room with the strategy or the risk response on the right-hand side. And every one of those are mitigated except the last one. Look at the last one it's actually an opportunity. And it says, given the recent earthquake, if the site's network or internet communications channel are delayed, then the system may be able to implement lower priority features with the extra time. So you could potentially exploit that. If that happens and it delays things, you can get other work done while it's being worked on. That's a good thing, right? You can take advantage of that. So that's an example of something that you would want to exploit. And with that, I did a number of references that I used. I think I learned a lot of the stuff at David Hilson's class down there, the 4th one. But you can see PMI has done a chapter in their body of knowledge. The Incose handbook has a process. Actually, PMI has a standard practice standard for risk management as well. DoD risk management guide is listed there. Risk Nav is a tool that people have used over the years as well. So I hope this has been helpful, and I hope you can use it and apply it on your job. Thanks. Bye.